So this lecture will review the text, The Racial Ignorance of White America. And I want you to consider the question, why did I assign this booklet? What does it have to do with the themes from the Allegory of the Cave? And first, it's a booklet about ignorance, right? Namely, the sort of overwhelming, pervasive racial ignorance of 1960s white America. The author, who was writing in 1967, is arguing that the majority of white Americans are blind to the ways in which systemic racism is built into America's social, political, and economic institutions. Right? So, in other words, the author is arguing that the problem of racism is not merely, or even primarily, the problem of too many bigots with too much hate in their heart. No. The problem, first and foremost, according to the author, is that America's economic and political systems unevenly distribute power to white communities while actively divesting power from black communities. So, achieving equality, therefore, doesn't just mean undoing the worst forms of segregation and bigotry and decreasing the numbers of racists in society. Rather, equality actually requires a total restructuring of the economy, how resources, wealth, and economic opportunities are produced and distributed throughout the society. Moreover, in terms of the ignorance of white America in the 60s, just consider the fact that at the height of the civil rights movement in the mid-1960s, most of the white people in this country withheld their solidarity from the civil rights struggle. The overwhelming majority of white Americans refused to support black Americans in the freedom struggle. Most white Americans made no attempt to educate themselves on the causes of all of the racialized rebellion they are seeing sweep across the country. On top of this, most white Americans were perpetually more upset by the inconvenience caused by the protests than they were ever upset by the racist horror and injustice that caused the protests in the first place. Right? In other words, white folks never really cared about and never really attempted to comprehend what it meant to be black and have to face down America during Jim Crow. So just consider the resistance that black folks faced in the civil rights struggle. I mean, resistance from white folks. It took a decade, right, of mass organizing and protest from 1954 to 1964 for black Americans to achieve even the slightest civil rights victories in the form of congressional legislation. They were followed, harassed, surveilled, beaten, jailed, murdered, firebombed, and lynched merely for trying to do away with legalized racial segregation. Okay, now the next reason for assigning this booklet is because it's a text about our ignorance today, namely our sort of historical ignorance of the civil rights movement era. And our ignorance is often the result of popular or mainstream narratives that nourish in our imaginations false and inadequate accounts of the civil rights movement. Many of us have grown up accepting distorted and incomplete histories of what the collective struggle for black freedom looked like in the 1960s. So, for instance, as a country, when we think about 20th century American racism, most of us usually think about the lack of voting rights for black Americans and segregated public facilities. We remember the mass protests and marches that attempted to desegregate society through nonviolent civil disobedience. And we remember the rhetoric of brotherhood, of unity, of love, of driving out hate, and turning the other cheek. And this history that we're taught is sort of a feel-good story of American progress. But this history which has been sort of absorbed into our collective consciousness, is a very sanitized and watered down narrative. It's a sort of myth about how peaceful protest and nonviolence back in the 60s led to the moral triumph of love over hate and equality over oppression. It's a story that falls pleasantly on the ear and is in many ways offered up for our passive acceptance, just like so many shadows projected onto the wall of Plato's cave. But the problem is this. The histories that were taught in high school, for instance, and the histories that are propagated in popular media, they almost always refuse to honestly engage with the extent and sheer terror of American genocidal racism in the 20th century. Right? We just aren't taught about the lynching festivals, the sundown towns in the Midwest where I live, where black folks could not enter after dark without fear of being brutalized or killed. We're not taught about the massacres of entire black communities by white hordes, like Black Wall Street in Tulsa in the 1920s. We weren't taught about white mob violence, blockbusting, and redlining, where government policy explicitly directed financial institutions and homeowners associations to keep their neighborhoods entirely white and not to invest money into black communities. We weren't taught about the regularity of police torture and the sort of incestuous relationship between the Jim Crow cops and the KKK. Popular civil rights narratives also did not teach us about the very effective use of violence and property destruction, and the effective use of armed self-defense that black rebels relied on in order to successfully confront all of the racism at the time. As compared to the way that we actually celebrate the riotous property destruction of the Boston Tea Party and the Stamp Act riots and Stamp Act rebellions waged by our kind of riotous colonial American forefathers. And the truth of the matter, though, is that some of the most important leaders in the Black freedom movement, besides Martin Luther King, and some of the Black freedom movement's most influential events, like the Birmingham riot in 1963, and some of the movement's most effective tactics, which included the use of counter-violence and property destruction, have been sort of erased from our popular social memory. And so those are the two forms of ignorance that I want us to think about in dealing with this text and connecting it to the allegory of the cave, which is all about ignorance, right? The ignorance of white Americans back in the 60s, and then also our ignorance when we look back in the 1960s. All right, so let's turn to the text itself and consider some of the author's arguments. And then we can think about whether those arguments are true. So the author argues that white America deludes itself and rationalizes the racist evil that it knowingly or unknowingly perpetuates. The author argues that there's this sort of entrenched white resistance to movements for black equality, and this resistance has been the underlying orientation of white America throughout the country's history. It's just that this white resistance simply resurfaces and shows its ugly head during those social upheavals that successfully garner national attention. He argues that the ordinary white American has much more in common with the racist white segregationist than he has in common with the ordinary black person. Most white Americans, he argues, are embedded in a condition of deep racial ignorance and are persistent in their refusal to battle that ignorance. And he argues that a feeling of white superiority, even if it's unconscious, characterizes most white perspectives on the questions of racism, such that most whites don't believe they need to read books on racism in order to understand its prevalence and how it operates. more. He argues that achieving equality for Black Americans requires far more than doing away with segregation and protecting Black voting rights. Rather, racial equality requires a sort of radical wealth and opportunity redistribution, right? What he refers to as a $1 trillion restructuring of the American economy. And lastly, right, he argues that if we fail to address this racialized economic inequality and mass poverty, this will inevitably just lead to more social unrest, more disorder, more protests, and yeah, even more riots, right, if America fails to act. So those are the arguments, and they're a bit more kind of radical and severe in their critique of racism at the time than we're used to associating with the rhetoric and the arguments that we normally associate with civil rights leaders in the 60s. All right, so let's think about some of those reflective homework questions. One of the homework questions asks, how did it make you feel, especially if you're white, when the author writes that it's out of a sense of superiority that the white people of America believe they have so little to learn regarding issues of race and racism? So, is the author being unfair to white people here? Is he talking about all white people? Many of my students in the past have kind of criticized the author for, quote, accusing all white people, and they're thinking specifically of this passage. But was he referring to all white people, right? If we skip just a few paragraphs later, he continues writing that this characterization of white America is necessarily general, and it would be grossly unfair to omit recognition of a minority of white folks who genuinely want authentic equality. Their commitment, he says, is real, sincere, and is expressed in 1,000 deeds. But the problem is that they are kind of counterbalanced, on the other hand, by all of the segregationists who are devoted to maintaining the status quo. So, in response to the question, is the author accusing all white people of being racist or racially ignorant? And according to his own words, right, he is explicitly, unambiguously not accusing all white people. Rather, he's pointing out the fact that the overwhelming majority of white people have become well-adjusted to the injustice of their society. He's pointing out that the overwhelming majority of white people are like prisoners in Plato's cave, right, who have been indoctrinated into an indifference about the civil rights struggle. Okay, so I want to speak a little bit about the author of this text because it's really quite relevant to the larger point I want to make about the relevance of Plato's allegory of the cave. So this booklet that I assigned is an excerpt from chapter 2 of a book called Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos, Our Community, published in 1967. And that book was written by Martin Luther King Jr. It was the last book he wrote before he was assassinated. So Martin Luther King is the, quote, anonymous author of The Racial Ignorance of White America. I gave the text that title, The Racial Ignorance of White America, because that's what King is diagnosing, right, in this particular text here, at least the excerpts from it. Now, in my in-person classes, when I reveal to students that King is the author of the text, this comes almost always as a big shock and a surprise. And so we want to think about this, right? Why are students shocked to discover that it was King who articulated such hard and cutting truths and developed such radical critiques of America and the majority of white folks in America? Why are we shocked? Well, as it turns out, people don't actually read anything that Martin Luther King wrote. And I'm generalizing, right? Most people don't actually read anything that King wrote. However, this doesn't really stop folks, especially lots of white folks, from nonetheless evoking King's legacy as a way to, scold contemporary black protesters, lecturing them to get off the streets and obey the police. This is something that white America continues to do to this day, which can be a very infuriating thing for a lot of people, right? When you have folks who have never studied or read King themselves start telling protesters that they, quote, have forgotten the words of Martin Luther King, you can understand how that might be very upsetting to people who are actually, fighting for racial justice today. Why else do you think we can't recognize King as the author? Well, this is the real connection to Plato's Allegory of the Cave, right? It has to do with the fact that as a society, we have been fed and have passively accepted this distorted shadow version of King, right? That is sort of on offer for us. In other words, we have grown up inheriting a sanitized, defanged version of MLK and his philosophy, right? We've passively accepted and been shown sort of half-truths about how loving and feel-good King was, right? And he was, he loved everyone, right? But we remove the critical edges, right, from King's rhetoric and his analysis. This is what the philosopher Cornel West refers to as the sort of Santa Clausification of MLK, right? That feel-good version of King that's safe to bring home to mom and dad, but yet waters down his critiques of white supremacy, right? So mainstream historical memory, it doesn't really remember King as the anti-capitalist radical who was largely despised in his own time. And because most Americans have never really actually read his speeches or his books, as a culture, we've actually become incapable of recognizing the anti-racist philosopher when we read what he actually wrote. In fact, without fail, each time that I assign this text in my classes, a handful of students actually go so far as to claim that the author, MLK, is in fact racist, right? Racist against white people. Obviously, right, nothing could be further from the truth. But we hear his critiques of white supremacy, and then we take that as just a criticism that all white people are racist, which is very clearly not what King is saying. In fact, I can share some of the comments from previous semesters where students are kind of grappling with the kind of racialized anxiety that gets triggered when they're reading this text, not knowing that they're reading King. Some students have said, and this is quoting, right, "It makes me absolutely sick that someone would write that and assume somebody's beliefs by the color of their skin, which is exhibiting the same behavior they swear to fight against." Right? Another student has written that I do not subscribe to this idea that the majority of white people are racist, and to say that is such a fascist way of thinking. I am afraid to know how many people feel as though that is true. I mean, clearly King is not fascist, right? I think it is wrapped in hate and contempt for white people, and I am not interested in drawing information from things that are wrapped in hate and contempt for any one group of people, especially from the characterization of race. So this is a really kind of interesting phenomenon, right? Why people are reading King and drawing the conclusion that he's a fascist or has nothing but contempt and hatred for white people, right? Something happens when folks read critiques of white supremacy and then take it as some sort of condemnation that all white people are bigots, even if that's not at all what the author is articulating, right? In this case, King. Right? Nothing King said in the excerpt was even remotely racist against white people. But these are similar to the reactions of many white folks back in the 60s, right? They held the view that he was racist against whites. And we often forget, right, that he was despised and hated in his own time by the majority of white people. So, we want to think about that. What does it mean that even today, many white folks still really, really kind of dislike Martin Luther King when they actually start reading him? And again, I don't want to make anyone feel bad or feel ignorant if you had no idea that it was King that you were reading, right? I wouldn't have known this was Martin Luther King when I was 19 or 20 because, I hadn't read anything that he wrote. And I was only fed a sort of sanitized version of MLK that never really foregrounded the substance of his critiques of white supremacy, of his critiques of our economic and political systems, of his kind of critiques of a racism that he said wasn't just about negative attitudes, but a racism that was just deeply embedded in our basic political economic institutions, which like to present themselves as race neutral, but actually are not. So when we think about King's actual philosophy, we need to remember that he was an enemy of the status quo. The essence of Dr. King's message was not love everyone and don't see color, right? His dream for the future was that we would live in a society where people didn't see color, but we just can't not see color now because that's not going to allow us to address all of the ways in which racism manifests in society, right? King's message, the essence of King's message of hope, was rather dismantle white supremacy, right? Return economic and political power to communities themselves, reevaluate capitalist values which have sort of impoverished our spirit, build egalitarian communities of love here and now, what he called the beloved community, right? The essence of Dr. King's philosophy was to confront the racial ignorance of white America, again, the racial ignorance of the majority of white folks in the country, and confront the lie of the American dream, which does not give everyone an equal opportunity. Yet King's message, right, has been intentionally watered down to make it easier for mainstream consumption, and we're dealing with a situation where we have a country's who simultaneously celebrates and erases King. And it does that because his philosophy still poses these direct challenges to the status quo, right? To our economic and our political institutions. So, right, King has been sort of strategically lifted up and away from the grit and the grime of the things he was actually saying. He gets enshrined as a cute fantasy figure in the halls of power, as powerful politicians on all sides of the political spectrum celebrate him with lip service while they help to maintain those very economic and political systems which he strove to dismantle. So there's a lot more to say about this text. I'm going to stop here. I would encourage you, if you have family and friends, have them read The Racial Ignorance of White America anonymously. Ask them what they think about the text and what they think about the author's arguments. And then tell them the author is Martin Luther King and see if that kind of, engenders a really productive, helpful discussion about how we kind of deal with race and the racialized anxieties that often emerge for white folks even today when we read folks like Martin Luther King. Okay, thanks.